Hello and welcome to the free GRE Prep Hour. It's great to have you all with us. So, I'm Céilidh Erickson, and we are going to be discussing GRE timing tonight. So, we're talking about why timing is important on the GRE, and we're going to be developing a timing strategy. So we're going to talk about how to time yourself during the exam itself, and then how to get ready for GRE timing, how to build yourself up to test day timing. So tell me this, how many of you have taken the real GRE before? If you click on the chat button, you can type messages in there, send chats to the group. All right, we've got some people who have taken the real GRE. How many of you have taken a practice test? At least one practice test? For those of you who've taken practice tests, you probably saw that timing is really, really, really crunched on the GRE. I remember the first time I took a GRE practice test, I was really shocked and surprised at how crunched and constrained the timing was. So this is not like tests back in high school or college where they give you a comfortable amount of time and you've got loads of time to go back and check over your work. This is a very time constrained test. So for those of you who've taken practice tests, or if you've taken the real thing, did any of you struggle with the timing? Feel like you were running out of time or anything like that? Yeah. Some people struggle with timing on the quant but not the verbal. Some people on the verbal but not the quant. A lot of us really find that the whole thing is really time constrained and difficult to pace yourself during. So that is what I want us to tackle tonight. How can you get yourself to the point where, you know, it's like training for a marathon, right? So if you were training for a marathon, you would build yourself up gradually to being able to run 26 miles at a time. So that's kind of what we need to do on the GRE. And just a note here, the problems that we're going to be using are problems either from or modeled after problems in the 5-pound book of GRE Practice Problems. So if you're just starting out your studies, this is a great place to start. It has all the problems you could ever need to practice with. So for those of you who haven't ever taken a GRE before, just a quick review of what the test is going to look like. You're definitely going to get the essays to start off with, but then you get a mix and match of quant and verbal sections. You always get 2 quant sections that count, 2 verbal that count, and 1 experimental. So could be that your experimental is verbal, it could be that your experimental is quant, but you're never going to know which one the experimental section is. But one thing I want to point out is here, we'll do a little math test for you guys. If you have 7 sections that are all at least 30 minutes apiece, roughly how long is this whole test? And include a little 10-minute break in there as well. Roughly how long is this entire thing? Yeah, it's about 4 hours. That is exhausting. That's a lot, a lot to train yourself up for. And for a lot of us, the essays at the beginning are the part that we care about the least. A lot of graduate school programs don't care that much about the essay, and what they really want to know is what your quant score is and what your verbal score is from 130 to 170. So we need to train ourselves to be able to pace well from beginning to end of that entire 4-hour stretch. Now, within a given section, here's what's kind of cool about the GRE. The GRE is actually really predictable. We know exactly what the order of that section is going to look like. It's going to start with QC, and then you're always going to get some discrete quant, then some data interpretation, and then some more discrete quant. And for those of you who've never seen GRE questions before, let's do a really quick rundown of what quantitative comparison questions actually are. Can anyone just give us a quick rundown? What is QC, this quantitative comparison? Well, the structure is always going to look like this. You're going to have quantity A, and then over here, quantity B, and then you're asked to compare two quantities, or compare what's underneath these two quantities. So maybe the upfront information would say something like, I don't know, here would be a very easy one. X equals 5, and then it asks you to compare X to 6. And then your job is to decide which quantity is greater. So answer choice A would stand for quantity A is greater. B would stand for B is greater. And then what about C? What does C stand for? C would stand for the two quantities are equal. And D would stand for we don't know, cannot be determined. So if, for example, in this example, if instead of saying X equals 5, it said X is greater than 5, and we were asked to compare X to 6, well, in that case, it would be D. We don't know, because maybe they're equal, maybe X is 1,000,000. We wouldn't be able to tell. So that's a little bit about what QC looks like. Discrete quant, that's actually much simpler. Discrete quant is what the GRE likes to call standard multiple choice, fill in the blank questions, and sometimes choose all that apply questions. Data interpretation, these are your charts and graphs. And then they'll give you some more discrete quant questions. So here, oh, some folks are wondering about how the chat works. Yeah, if people are chatting in there, we can all see the responses. You can send private chats to me, but probably better just to send it to the whole room. That way everyone can see what people are thinking. So here's the really nice thing about knowing that the GRE is going to go exactly in this order. It means that we can pace ourselves and know exactly how much time we want to spend on QC questions, and then when we should start discrete quant, when we should start the data interpretation section, and so on. But before we do that, another math quiz for you. You may or may not know that within a quant section, we get 20 questions every time, and we have 35 minutes to do 20 questions. So roughly how long should you be spending per question? "20 questions in 35 minutes. It's really time constrained. Yeah, about 1.75 minutes, less than 2 minutes per question in any case. And what you'll find is that the GRE is not as nice as your high school teacher who wrote questions that you could easily do in the amount of time that they gave you. On the GRE, there will be a lot of questions that actually take way more than 2 minutes to solve. And so part of this test, it's not just about how well you solve, it's about your decision making. Not every question is equally worth your time. Here's one really important thing to keep in mind. Within this set of 20 questions, they're all worth the same. So the questions that take you 30 seconds to solve and the questions that take you 3.5 minutes to solve, they're equally valuable. So it's often a bad idea to spend 3.5 minutes on a given question if that means that you'll run out of time and not get the ones that you could have gotten faster. So more on that in a little bit. But verbal section, who knows what comes first in the verbal section? The first question type that you get on every verbal section? Text completion always comes first on verbal. Then you get some reading comp, then you get sentence equivalence, and then some more reading comp. Just like with the quant, there's some variation in how many of each you get. Could be 6, but maybe on some it could be 7, maybe it could be 5. But typically we've seen 6 on the majority of verbal sections. So same 20 questions here, but what about timing for the verbal? Here's where the GRE gets really mean. They make verbal even more constrained than the quant. You get 30 minutes to do 20 questions instead of 35. Especially if English is not your first language, that makes this really painfully time constrained. And the way that you want to think about how that breaks down, the text completion and the sentence equivalence, those are the kinds of questions that give you a sentence with a blank in it, and you are asked to fill in that blank with vocabulary. Oh, I see a question in the chat about do you have access to the PowerPoint after the session? We can't actually send the slides because some of this is copyrighted material, but we do post these videos to YouTube, so you can go back and watch them at any point. And you can also, hey, you can take screenshots at any point here and I'll never know, right? So feel free to do that, but we will post this entire video on YouTube probably by tomorrow. So, what does all of this mean, this test structure? Well, it means that we can actually chart our timing pretty carefully. If they just gave us kind of questions in random order, we would then just have to think about how to break up 35 minutes into chunks. But the fact that they give us all the QC at the beginning, and then discrete quant, and then data interpretation, and then discrete quant, means we can actually time ourselves pretty carefully. And so a few things to keep in mind here. When we're thinking about our QC timing, QC, you want to spend about a minute 15 per question, as opposed to the minute 45 on average. And that's because with a lot of QC, there's less solving to do, there's less math. Sometimes it's just about comparing, but without actually solving. And then if you go more quickly through that, if you spend 10 minutes on those 7 questions, then for discrete quant, you can spend about 2 minutes per question. So I had a great question in the chat here, which is it better to skip a question if it takes too long to figure out? And the answer is absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. Not all these questions are worth your time. And we're going to do an investigation later on about what's worth our time and what's not worth our time. The one thing I will say is there's no penalty for guessing. So don't leave it blank. If you're skipping, just pick a random letter. Just pick your favorite letter. And then there's always a chance that you might get it right. But you definitely should be skipping some things, guessing quickly and moving on with these. Generally speaking, what I would say is if you are not yet scoring in the 160s, you should probably be skipping several questions per section. And then once you cross the 160 threshold, then you can attack every single question and try to get closer and closer to perfect accuracy. But up until then, you can get a 160 and still get a ton of questions wrong. So pick and choose the ones you want to get wrong. The really hard ones, get them wrong quickly and move on so that you can double down on the questions that are more gettable. So yeah, more about gettable versus not gettable later. But with this timing chart idea, the cool thing is you don't actually have to look up at the clock. I mean, the clock will be there in the corner of your screen, but you don't want to spend a lot of time looking at the clock and trying to calculate where you are versus where you should be, because that's, you know, that's a huge time suck. So if you can memorize your timing benchmarks, that can make life a lot easier. So the idea here is that when you get your first question, first one will be a QC question, you'll have 35 minutes up there on the clock. And when it flips over, when you see your first discrete quant question, then look up at the clock and this is what you should see on the screen. If you see more than 25 minutes left, that's a great thing. That means you're ahead of time. If you see less than 25 minutes remaining, then you're behind time. That might not necessarily be a huge problem, but it probably means you need to skip something. Good rule of thumb is if you're ever more than 2 minutes behind, you have to throw something away. A lot of people, when I say, okay, you need to skip something, you need to guess and move on, they'll look at the next question and they'll read it and they'll think about it and they'll take another 30 or 40 seconds trying to figure out what their guess would be. Well, that's time that you don't have. When I say throw something away, I mean if you realize going into your first discrete quant question that you only have 23 minutes left on the clock, then in the next few questions you need to, within seconds, be like, nope, not attempting this one. I'm going to pick D and move on, or whatever your favorite letter is. And, same at any point in these benchmarks. So here you can see you're spending 10 minutes for these first 7 questions, and then 10 minutes for every 5 questions after that, roughly. So 35, 25, 15, 10, it's pretty easy to remember on the quant side. Verbal, the numbers are a little messier, a little harder to memorize, but hey, just kind of screenshot this, write it down, and memorize this when you're going in to take your next practice test. 30, 24, 13, 9. Now, we talked about what to do if you're behind on time. What should you do if you're ahead on time? Yeah, if you're ahead on time, that's great. That is kind of what you want to aim for, like those tests back in high school where your teachers gave you time to go back and review all your work. The thing though is, at best, you probably would have 2, maybe 3 minutes left. If you're a real speed demon, maybe you'd have 4 or 5 minutes left at the end of the test. But that's definitely not enough time to go back to every single question. So what you're going to want to do is mark only a few gettable ones to go back to. And then you'll be able to see on there's a review screen function, and it'll show you which ones you marked. So you don't want to mark the ones that the first time around you're like, this was crazy hard, I'm not sure how to do it. You want to mark the ones that you're like, I know how to do this, but I just need a little bit of extra time. Or the ones that you're like, I'm pretty sure I got this, but I want to double check my work. That's a good use of your time to go back. Good use of your extra time at the end of the section. Questions on any of this, of how to use this timing system, or what our timing benchmark should be, anything like that? All right. Well, then let's take a look at how to get good at timing. The first one might be pretty obvious. You got to take practice exams and you have to take them accurately timed. It doesn't really help if when you're taking practice exams, you're pausing to work on problems, or you're giving yourself extra time, or you're taking extra breaks, things like that. Um, oh, someone asked me, going back to here for a moment, should you make a pass through? And I assume you mean like to look at all the questions first and then decide which ones you want to do first. You can do that. I think that that's absolutely a possibility. The problem is, you know, back when you were taking other tests that were on paper, you could look and you could see all of the questions that you were going to get kind of in one go. And it was easy to be like, okay, starting with that one, then that one, then that one. When it's computer based, the time that it takes to click through might not actually be time that you can afford. And you might forget to click all the way back. The thing that I would say is some people like to do it that way. I find that most people find that more cumbersome. But if you're interested in doing it that way, you have to practice on at least 2 practice tests. See what it feels like to click all the way through first, and mark down the questions that you want to go to. So try it, see how it works. And likewise with reading comp, you know how when you were taking the SAT or other standardized tests on paper, you could read all the questions first before reading the passage, which I loved doing because I was like, okay, these are all the things I'm going to be asked. I know that before going into this passage. You can do that on the GRE, but you just have to be careful that if you clicked forward 4, I've seen people click forward 4 and then only click back 3, you know, and they miss a question just from clicking wrong. So just be careful of those things. So practice exams are obviously crucial to build up that, you know, marathon style stamina, but it's not as if you can do that every day. In fact, you probably shouldn't even do it every week. While you're still learning the content, you really don't want to take more than 1 practice test every 2 weeks because, you know, you won't have done enough in the meantime to see improvement, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting to take practice tests. So what I recommend is at the beginning of your process, definitely take a diagnostic. For those of you who are brand new to this and have never taken a practice test at all yet, dive in and just take one cold, see how it feels. It'll probably feel pretty terrible, right? The timing will be awful, and that's fine. It'll just get you used to it. And then from there on out, give yourself a few weeks between practice tests. Give yourself enough time to really improve before you take the next one. So what can you then do in the meantime if you want to get gradually better and better at GRE timing, but you don't want to sit down and take a full practice exam? Well, that's where you can introduce timed sets. So let's talk about doing time sets. Those of you who have this 5-pound book of practice problems, this we have specifically designed to do time sets so that you're not just doing one problem and looking at the answer, and then doing the next problem and looking at the answer, but that you can set a timer and do problem after problem after problem after problem in a row like you would on the real thing. So Manhattan 5-Pound Guide is a great resource for this, already designed for it. You should also get the ETS official guide. If you don't have a copy of that yet, that's one thing you should purchase because these are real questions that were on the real exam, and it'll give you a sense of the style of how they write questions. There are also some other resources out there like the, if you go to the ETS website, there's the paper-based practice test. And there's some other resources on the ETS site. Other prep companies probably have other resources out there as well. But the Manhattan Prep 5-Pound Guide and the ETS official guide are well designed to do sets of problems in a row. And why do time sets rather than individual problems? Well, it puts you in a different mindset, right? It's not just about, can I get this question right? It's within this set of 5 problems, are they all worth my time? And if I've spent too long on this one, I need to speed through this one, or I need to choose which ones are worth my time and which ones aren't. You also get to practice pattern recognition by doing a lot in a row that are all mixed. Shifting your brain from one thing to another makes you more nimble. And then I really want to highlight this idea. GRE is above all a decision-making test, not a math test, not a verbal test. It's trying, imperfectly, as standardized tests are all imperfect, but it's trying to assess your logical thinking. And the language that it uses to assess logical thinking is math or verbal. But for most people, you cannot finish every single problem in the time constraint that they give you. So the decision of which one should I commit to versus which ones should I just guess and move on, that is kind of the most important decisions you have to make, right? So, okay, that's where and why. Let's take a look at how. At the beginning of your process, it's going to be kind of uncomfortable to do long sets of problems at a time, so build yourself up to that gradually. You could even do 2 questions in a row, and then the next week 3 in a row, and then the next week 4 in a row, if you want to be really gradual about it. But I think 4 question chunks are good chunks, and you want to set a goal for each set. And so when I say goal, I don't mean my goal is to get all 4 of them right. You want to set process goals, which means what are you going to do well? So for those of you who know me, you know one of my favorite things to set as a process goal is put the pen down and think through the problem before solving. This is something I often yell at my students. Put the pen down. You're doing too much math. Think about it first. If you want, go back to YouTube. I have a whole lesson on to do better on quant. You need to put the pen down. So that could be a goal. Just, I'm going to step back and think through problems before diving in. You could have another goal that's, you know, careful and neat algebra. Or your goal could be try to prove D in QC problems. Whatever that is for you, the skill that you want to work on, set that intention before you start that problem set. And then afterwards, evaluate yourself not on how many you got right, but evaluate yourself on, did I really stick to that goal? Did I do what I set out to do well? And did I manage my time well? Did I make good decisions about what to skip versus what to commit to? Yeah, questions on that? For a lot of you, at the beginning of your process, in a set of 4 problems, you might want to skip 1 out of every 4. Certainly by the time you're doing 8 question sets, you're going to be skipping something out of those 8 questions. And when you're going back and reviewing, you want to congratulate yourself, being like, yeah, I made absolutely the right decision to skip what I skipped. So it's not just about counting number of questions right and wrong. It's about evaluating your decision making. All right. So that's how to work up to these practice sets. Oh, and it should go without saying, you know, you should time yourself using probably just the stopwatch on your phone. And you can use the lap function to figure out how much time you spent per problem. But what you really want is to develop that awareness of which problems you're spending too long on, which are you not spending enough time on. So thinking about timing, here's a good general rule. Because you get less than 2 minutes per question, give yourself 7 minutes for every 4 quant questions. So if you're doing a set of 8 problems, that would be 14 minutes total. You get the idea. Verbal is a little bit trickier because text completion and sentence equivalence, you want to be moving through those faster than you do with the reading comp. So if you give yourself barely over a minute, so maybe 5 minutes for a set of 4, and then with reading comp, it depends on how many questions there are per passage, but roughly a minute and a half, maximum 2 minutes to read the passage, and then about a minute, minute and a half per question. Yeah, questions on that idea? If you have a question, sorry, I'm getting questions in 2 different. Someone just asked, do we need to memorize the formulas for quadratic equation and Pythagorean theorem? Quadratic equation, no. Pythagorean theorem, yes, although you won't be using it that often. And if you're wondering, what rules do I need to know? The 5-pound book has all of them. It has math facts, everything you need to know, everything you need to memorize. But it is really important to know that it's not about memorizing formulas. Yes, you're going to need to remember the volume of a cylinder again. But most questions on the GRE that are hard aren't hard because of the content, the rules involved. It's hard because of the question structure. Yeah. The other thing that I will say is when we're thinking about our timing balance, like, on the verbal, a little over a minute for text completion and sentence equivalence, and then about under 2 minutes to read the passages and about a minute, minute and a half per question. You want to think about what works for you. If text completion and sentence equivalence are your strength, but only if you spend extra time on those, then maybe you want to go faster through reading comp and dedicate more time to those. So play around with it. Make sure that you've practiced enough to know what balance works for you. These are all general rules of thumb, but obviously some people need more of some things and less of others. And I got a great question about the first practice test. Should I time myself on the first practice test? And my answer is yes. I think you should time yourself always. Just know that your score is probably going to be terrible on the first one, but that's fine because you don't know the stuff yet. You want to get a feel for not just what kinds of questions there are and how to solve them, but you kind of want to start building that muscle of decision making, of knowing when to guess as you're learning to solve. So my recommendation is, yeah, time yourself always throughout. Doesn't help to be nicer to yourself in the beginning and then try to tighten up on yourself later on. All right, you guys know what's coming up next? I'm going to give you guys an actual time set to do. Instead of a 4-question time set, 3 was really all I could fit on one slide. So we're going to do a 3-question time set. And I'm going to give you just a hair under 6 minutes to do a set of 3. I'll give you 5 minutes, 45 seconds. So I want you guys to be really thoughtful about how you're allocating your time, where you're spending too much time, not enough time, whatever. And I'm going to put you to work. So 5 minutes and 45 seconds for this set of 3, starting now. All right. I'm just going to take away the PowerPoint for a minute, just give you guys all a chance to breathe. Um, so, yeah, how did that feel? Sorry, I'm getting a weird pop-up. Um, I don't know what that means. Um, so little under 6 minutes to do those three questions. What you probably noticed was that at least one of those questions was a lot scarier than the others. So yeah, it's kind of stressful to do one after the other, and to know that that time crunch is coming. So I want to talk about not how to solve each one, because we probably don't have time for that. I will tell you the answers, and you can, you know, figure out the how to solve those on your own. But what I really want to talk about is good decision making. So, coming back to these problems, when I said earlier that some of these are probably less worth your time than others, let's talk about return on investment time-wise. Um, any guesses as to which of these I think is least worth your time? The second one, actually. Yeah. And we'll talk about why. Looking at this first one, QC, QC in general is a really good time investment. I mean, not always, not every single QC question, but generally speaking, QC is a good investment because, well, a couple things. There are only four possible answers as opposed to five with standard multiple choice, or infinite when you have fill in the blank. Um, and a lot of times you can often remove several, or I should say, you can often remove at least one answer. So on this one, what answer do you think we can remove before we've even done any work at all? D. There's no way that it cannot be determined because these are all numbers. There's no X here, there's no unknown. And so if everything is a real number, then each of these two quantities has a knowable value. We just need to figure out what it is. From there, this this one is I think, pretty good time investment. That doesn't mean it's an easy question. This ends up testing about medium hard, actually, because it's easy to make mistakes on. But this one is a good ROI because um, you know how to do the math. It just takes careful math. But there's no crazy hidden formula, nothing really complicated going on. It's just, can you do it methodically? And can you compare rather than calculate? There's another way that we can sometimes save time with QC, and that's to think of it this way. We can imagine that there is an inequality sign kind of hovering between these two. Either this one's greater or this one's greater, or they're equal, or maybe we don't know. But imagine that there is this sign between the two, but we just can't see it. It's like an inequality where that inequality sign in the middle is hidden. But we can actually do to both sides the same things that we could do with an inequality. And so by that I mean, if we're taking these operations, a certain decimal of a certain fraction of a certain percent of 150, but if the 150 is the same in both, we can kind of just ignore that 150 and just deal with the other calculations carefully. Think about where our powers of 10 are in numerators or denominators. You could, if you wanted, try to put all of this into your calculator, but I really advise against relying on the calculator too much because the calculator, the on-screen calculator that you get on the GRE does not have many functions, and you're not going to be able to easily put things in parentheses and stuff like that. So this one is probably best done by hand, and it's not too bad. What I'll do is I'll just give you the answer. Feel free to screenshot it and prove it out later if you didn't get this answer. But the answer on this one, go ahead and tell me in the chat, what'd you guys get? Nice. The answer is quantity A was greater. All right. This next one. This one is by far the worst question type. This one, this is modeled after an official guide question, and official guide questions like this, on some of the questions they'll post the p-values, in other words, the percentage of people who got it right. And questions like this always have very, 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 very low p-values. So numeric entry questions in general, generally low return on investment. That's because there aren't answer choices, right? They're not guessable at all. I can't spell the word guessable today. They're not guessable. Like if you were just going to be like, well, I don't know, on a multiple choice and like, let me just pick B, you'd at least have some chance of getting it right. But if you were like, let me just pick nearest 0.1%, I don't know. Let me pick 8.2%. There's almost no chance that you're going to get lucky enough to guess it correctly. But more than that, not having the answer choices means there's no safety net. When you're doing a problem and there is multiple choice and you get an answer and you look up and that answer is not there, then that's a safety net feature that you're like, oh, okay, well, I definitely did something wrong. Let me go back to the drawing board and figure out what my mistake was. And the other thing, some features of the GRE are really nice. The fact that they let us circle back to problems, and mark things to go back to, all of that's great. The fact that they give us a calculator is great. But here's the one thing that I think is really mean. We can't count on these to be clean numbers. You'd think that if it's numeric entry, you'd end up with nice, clean, easy to work with numbers. But that's not actually the case. The correct answer to this one, to the nearest 0.1%, is 27.8%. So you could have done all the right math and rounded the wrong way or not taken the right decimal point or something like that, and you would get the whole thing wrong. So it's important to note that there is never any partial credit. So that means numeric entry are really low ROI, but choose all that apply are also low ROI questions. So when you're thinking about where to allocate your time, it is actually crazy to me that this question and then this question are worth the same, right? So why would you spend a ton of time on this one and then you have no safety net and you're not going to be at all sure that you got it right, versus this one where if you're careful, you can definitely get this right. This is math that any fifth grader could do if they were careful. It is easy to mess up, that's for sure. But this is the kind of problem that you should be committing to. And in fact, this is the kind of question that you should mark and go back to. And that feels weird, doesn't it? Like, you kind of want to mark this one because you're like, this is the hard one. This is what I want to spend my time on. But that's a bad time investment. You want to double down on making sure you get the gettable ones. This is a question that most people should skip. And I would actually say, most people who are pressed for time, until they're hitting at almost or at the 160 level, should probably skip all numeric entry. They're just not worth the return on investment. And then for this last one, I think that this is another good example of one that's gettable if you're careful. But there are a lot of ways to potentially mess this up. So let's brainstorm. What are some mistakes that people might make on a question like this? Yeah. Mistakes people make. Forgetting zero. Forgetting negatives. And yeah, exactly. It's not about what is why, it's about counting. So any question that asks how many, you might do all the math correctly, but if you miss one, you're going to get it wrong. So be really careful with your count. The math is easy, but it's also easy to make mistakes on. So for this one, if we want to simplify, y squared minus 2 less than or equal to 10, we'd simplify it to y squared less than or equal to 12. Sometimes the less than versus less than or equal to might be an issue. Like if it were y squared less than or equal to 9 versus y squared less than 9, we'd want to worry about whether it's inclusive or not. On this one, it didn't matter too much. But let's make sure we don't forget 0, we don't forget negatives. If we're listing all of the integers whose squares are less than or equal to 12, what are we looking at? We're thinking about our number line. Got 3, also 2, 1, but we don't want to forget the negative versions of all those, -1, -2, -3. And so that gives us a total of 7. So I would say if we're thinking about this set of 3, and we're thinking about our timing, with this set of 3, for most people, what I would recommend is skipping this one, at least to start, doubling down on this one and making sure you get it right, doubling down on this one and making sure you get it right, and only when you've gotten the really gettable ones, then you can circle back to this one and give it a try. If this one were multiple choice, different story, but since it's numeric entry, probably best just to leave it alone, dedicate your time to the others. So for this last one, the answer was 7 because all of the integers that satisfy y squared less than or equal to 12 be -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, and 3. So there are 7 integers that work for this statement. It's not that the number 7 works. That was not what it was asking, but it was how many integers are there that fit. And yeah, we see how that could be an easy question to misread or answer incorrectly or something like that. All right. So I hope that you guys have learned some things about how to think about your timing for this exam, and think about the fact that above all, it is not a math test or a verbal test. It is a decision-making test. And so I want to just leave you with this. This test is hard, but there are things that you can do to improve. Screen sharing failed. Hang on. Weird. Not sure what's going on with that. Come on, Zoom, what you doing? There we go. So you can absolutely study for this test on your own. Everything on here is learnable, but if you want more guidance, you are strongly, warmly encouraged to check out Manhattan Prep. You can attend any of our classes for free the first session of our course. It's not just an intro session, it is the first session out of our 8-week course. You can attend for free either in person or online. And we have lots of classes starting at all different times of day and days of week. So we'd love to have you there. Or GRE Interact if you want to self-study. It's on demand. It's online and it's adaptive. So as you get questions right, it gives you harder questions to do. If you get things wrong, it gives you more to practice there. And you get a whole week of that for free. So definitely check that out. Lots of other free resources on our blog. You can look for recordings of our past free GRE prep hours like this one. Yeah. So any questions on any of that? So it was great to have you with us. I am so delighted to have met you all virtually, and good luck in your studies. Take care. Good night, everyone.